Let me take you back to 2005. Nintendo has had a stranglehold on handheld gaming for the past decade and a half, ever since the launch of the original Game Boy. Numerous imitators and knockoffs had popped up during that time, but none had ever managed to provide any actual competition. But a new challenger would soon emerge. Spurred by the overwhelming success of their previous two home consoles, Sony would attempt to break into the handheld gaming market with the PlayStation Portable, and with one of its main selling points being its sheer power that allowed for games that more closely resembled what you'd expect from a home console, it should come as no surprise that many of the PSP's launch titles had previously appeared on its older siblings in some form or another. These retreads might not have been the most inventive, but they certainly proved their point. The PSP was capable of delivering the types of games that you simply couldn't hope to get on the Nintendo DS. Yet buried amongst all the remakes, ports, and annual sports releases, there were a handful of original games, and the most notable and weirdest of them all has to be Metal Gear Acid. When Sony first learned that they would have a brand new Metal Gear to accompany the launch of their handheld, I'm sure all the executives had to have been thrilled. After all, Metal Gear was synonymous with PlayStation, critically acclaimed for its technical innovations, and had cultivated a rabid legion of fans who were eager to learn more about the series' mythology. So the first time those executives actually saw Metal Gear Acid, I'm sure their hearts had to collectively sink a little bit. For one thing, that long-running mythology was largely tossed aside. Similar to its overlooked spiritual predecessor Metal Gear Ghost Babel, Acid takes place in an alternate timeline to the series proper, so any fans who had been hoping to maybe get a few hints about the truth behind the Patriots, or gain some new insights into one of their favorite characters in the lead-up to Metal Gear Solid 4, was out of luck. But what had to have been an even bigger shock was that the series' trademark brand of Tactical Espionage Action was given a major facelift and turned into a digital trading card game. Again, the whole point of the PSP was that it was capable of replicating the types of experiences that you'd get on a home console. So Konami's decision to debut one of their most iconic franchises with an entry that didn't closely resemble the ones that you'd get on a home console was certainly an interesting one. These days, Acid doesn't have much of a legacy. I mean, it sold well enough to merit a sequel, but even die-hard Metal Gear fans like myself tend to overlook it. However, writing it off as little more than a shameless cash grab would be doing Acid a tremendous disservice. While it might not be the typical Metal Gear experience we all fell in love with, Acid proves itself to be a fun, though admittedly flawed experience that's worthy of the Metal Gear name. What's up guys, Dusty here, coming at you from the Hotbox. If you enjoyed this video, then leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel, as I'd really appreciate it. And if you want to see more content like this, then let me know down in the comments. Alright, enough mindless self-promotion, let's get back to the good stuff. Despite its change in format, taking place in an alternate timeline, and lack of hands-on involvement from series creator Hideo Kojima, Acid did a great job approximating a lot of the charm of its big brothers, and nowhere is this more apparent than the story. The reason for this is that the job of directing the game was handed off to Shinta Nojiri, who had worked alongside Kojima ever since Police Knots, and had actually manned the director's chair for the earlier mentioned Ghost Babel. As a result, Acid's storyline has everything you'd expect from Metal Gear: government conspiracies, an enemy organization named after a canine, a colorful cast of villains, and enough plot twists to make M. Night himself cream his sheets. In fact, the game is so adamant about providing you with the proper Metal Gear experience that it might have originally served to its detriment. There's so much plot packed into the game's opening hours, which is also jammed full of so many tutorials, that it can easily become overwhelming. It took me about an hour just to get through the game's first 3 levels, so I can't imagine Acid was the first choice for most new PSP owners on the go. Trying to sneak in a quick session on the bus or subway, only to get caught in a lengthy stretch of dialogue, seems like it would have been a pretty common occurrence. But when you weren't attempting to speedrun missions on your way to school, I imagine it had to be pretty easy to appreciate the way Acid managed to replicate the series' aesthetic on a smaller scale. Most of the environments are pretty simplistic in terms of visual design, but they just have this clean look to them that makes them pleasing to the eye. Character models feature a nice amount of detail, and the various animations are all fluid. Acid might not have played like your traditional Metal Gear game, but it certainly looked the part. The soundtrack is also a highlight, capturing the essence of the Metal Gear sound that had been defined in Metal Gear Solid and Sons of Liberty, but it also branches out in some unexpected ways. The theme for the murderous marionette twins in particular stands out as one of the most chilling pieces of music I've heard in any game. But what might serve as the biggest selling point to play Acid these days is that the game is really just a giant love letter to the Metal Gear franchise. Every card is based on an item, a weapon, or character from a previous game, and every game that had been released up to that point was represented. Well, every Kojima-approved game anyway. Sorry, Snake's Revenge. And to say that Acid is chock full of fan service and nostalgia still wouldn't be doing it justice. Kojima might not have ever found a good reason to recall Snake's encounters against the likes of Machine Gun Kid or Running Man, but Acid served as the perfect excuse to shine a little bit of a spotlight on these forgotten characters from days gone by. And it's not just Metal Gear that gets some love, as there are even a handful of cards from other Kojima projects, such as Zone of the Enders and Police Knots. Some of the special character cards are even accompanied by brief clips from their respective games, which is a fantastic touch. Of course, to see all this stuff, you have to wrap your head around Acid's unique gameplay mechanics, and this is admittedly a pretty daunting prospect. Now, when you first hear that Acid features a card-based system, your mind probably goes to something like Yu-Gi-Oh!, and while that does get you on the right track, it doesn't tell the whole story, as Acid blends traditional collectible card game mechanics with elements from tactical RPGs, and even finds a way to include a healthy amount of stealth. So while the gameplay is broken up into turns where the player is allowed to utilize a number of the cards that they currently have in their hand, unlike most card games, you're not just squaring off against one opponent, and the feel of play is much more literal than Acid, as it's an actual environment that must be navigated, complete with traps and other hazards. By default, you can take 2 actions during your turn, and every card in Acid has a cost assigned to it, and the total cost at the end of your turn determines how much time you have to wait until the start of your next turn. I'll try and illustrate this for you all as simply as possible. Let's say that there's one enemy at the start of your turn, their cost is at 12. If you end your turn with a cost of 4, then the enemy's cost will drop to 8, but you'll be allowed to start your next turn. Of course, in most scenarios, you won't just be squaring off against a single enemy. There's a steep learning curve during the opening hours, and I have to imagine more than a few players will run off during this stretch. As I said earlier, the game is packed full of tutorials, but they aren't the most effective. Part of this is because Acid throws so much information at you in such a short period of time that it's hard to retain it all, and part of this is due to the fact that some of the mechanics just aren't properly explained. For instance, figuring out how to actually use weapon cards that had to be equipped just came down to trial and error on my part. Once it finally clicks for you though, you realize that a turn-based tactical RPG is actually a pretty great fit for the series, as observing your surroundings and carefully planning your course of action has always been an essential part of the Metal Gear DNA. And it's amazing how much it all still feels like Metal Gear despite the change in format. You can still hide in cardboard boxes, knock on walls to lure enemies over to C4, and use cigarettes to expose infrared lasers. It's just that in Acid you don't have to worry as much about being betrayed by your dumb thumbs or shoddy reflexes. With 200 cards to unlock and choose from, you certainly aren't suffering from a lack of options either, and when Acid is firing on all cylinders, it's a one-of-a-kind experience that proves to be a ton of fun. Unfortunately though, it's bogged down by a bunch of minor quirks and small quality of life issues that do keep it from reaching its full potential. One of the most frequent and annoying issues is that there are some missions which require you to have a certain card in your deck in order to complete it, such as a key card or C4, but you often aren't informed about this until you actually start said mission. On multiple occasions, I found myself starting a mission only to be informed I'd need a mine detector or something, so then I'd have to quit back to the main menu, edit my deck to include said card, and then hop back into the level. Also, it seems like it'd be a good idea to let you save multiple preset decks for different situations, like a stealth deck, a combat deck, or a support deck, right? I mean, it just makes a ton of sense, and it's been a staple of the genre for as long as I can remember, but for some reason it's a feature that's been omitted here in Acid. Speaking of standard features that were excluded from Acid, only the first cutscene during each mission can be skipped, so if you find yourself stuck on one that's giving you some trouble, you might find yourself having to sit through the same conversation 5 times in a row, which definitely isn't ideal. And while the actual gameplay works really well for the most part, as I alluded to earlier, there are times when you need a specific card to progress. So what happens when you get to one of these points and you don't have that card either in your hand or equipped? Absolutely nothing. Seriously, on more than one occasion, I found that my best bet was just to stand in place, discarding cards from my hand until I finally got the one I actually needed, and these moments were exactly as exciting as they sound. Now, some series just manage to catch lightning in a bottle and absolutely knock it out of the park on their first attempt. Metal Gear Acid was not one of those games. For everything it gets right, you're likely to encounter some inexplicable oversight that leaves you shaking your head and wondering just what the hell they were thinking. But Acid did establish a solid foundation to build off of, and apparently that's exactly what Nijiri and his team did, as I've heard nothing but good things about the sequel. When taken on its own, Acid might be one of the more uneven entries in the franchise, but it turns out even the weaker Metal Gears still have their merits. I give Metal Gear Acid 7 murderous marionettes out of 12.